Final Fantasy XVI takes Square Enix's role-playing franchise in a bold and divisive new direction. But is it the right direction? Let's find out. This review will be spoiler-free. There may be minor location and mechanics spoilers, but I've kept almost all major battles and story cutscenes limited to the first few hours of the game in this footage. In Final Fantasy XVI, you take on the role of Clive Rosfield, a noble-turned soldier whose goal is to fulfill a tragic mission set in motion by devastating events from his past. In this world of Valisthea, icons are the iconic Final Fantasy summons who've taken hosts to humans, imparting their powers in the form of a blessing for a select few. The story in this game is incredibly enjoyable, with twists and turns that are all grounded in a well-written script and engaging dialogue. It feels vastly different in both style and tone from Square Enix's recent output like Final Fantasy VII Remake 2. While I enjoy both styles, those who didn't like the direction in games like that shouldn't have any complaints here. That being said, I have seen some complaints about the story going off rails at certain points, especially later in the game, and while I don't fully disagree, I don't think the quality of the writing itself suffers. I still very much enjoyed the ride, and I think that this is a situation where the journey is far more important than the destination. Clive meets plenty of interesting characters along the journey, and all of the important characters are memorable and fleshed out. In fact, by the end of 16, I'd say it has one of my favorite main casts in the entire franchise. The story also comes at you pretty relentlessly. This game is very thick and story heavy and not short on cutscenes, which is something that I personally see as a positive. I think I found myself enjoying the story more and more as I progressed through it, and I believe that some could justify the purchase price for this game based on the storytelling alone. If that's all you're looking for in a Final Fantasy game, you won't be disappointed. But for most, a good story can't save a game that isn't fun to play. And on that front, I'm happy to report that this game really delivers. 16 sidesteps any pretense of keeping traditional Final Fantasy mechanics and fully embraces an action gameplay style. This is a first for a tentpole numbered Final Fantasy game and arguably a risky move, but that risk pays off in droves. There's a dash of Kingdom Hearts and Devil May Cry, yet Final Fantasy XVI falls somewhere in between the two, and it delivers an incredibly satisfying, fast-paced gameplay experience. Clive is your standard sword-wielding protagonist who can dole out attack after attack in extended combos. He's got elemental magic thanks to his icon powers, and these are integrated seamlessly into the melee combat in a really creative and unique way. As you progress through the game, you're able to unlock more and more powerful and expanded combat options, including charged attacks, new movement abilities, and even some abilities that let you combine the hack and slash with the magic. All of this is done through a secondary progression system that looks a lot like a skill tree, but whose nodes can be unlocked at any time if you have the points. There's a number of ways to approach combat in this game, and that is truly its greatest strength. Combat is always fun, feels really deep, and is shockingly easy to master. The magical abilities are further expanded too as you progress through the story. These unlock even more elemental icon abilities, each having their own unique strengths and weaknesses. Fans still hanging on to the old school traditional turn-based combat might be turned off by this new direction. If you're the type of person who prefers a slower-paced, methodical style of RPG combat, you might find yourself disappointed. Fortunately though, there are a few accessibility options that might make the transition a bit easier, at least for most. These include multiple difficulty levels and the addition of new equipable items given to you at the start of the game. These streamline the experience significantly. While they're entirely optional for the main story, they boil down the full suite of Clive's abilities to nearly a single repeated press of the attack button. While I'm sure some players will probably forego these accessories, they are still a great addition, and I even found some utility in one of them during my playthrough. You can issue commands to your wolf companion Torgal to attack your targeted enemy, and one of the accessories issues these commands automatically. I did eventually switch it out to make room for a stat buff accessory, but it's great to know that the option is always there if I want it. In addition to the standard combat you'll spend a majority of your time engaging with, there's an entire secondary combat style that appears throughout the story, albeit infrequently. These icon battle set pieces have you take on an opponent in what can best be described as the Final Fantasy spin on a kaiju battle. These battles are full of a ridiculous amount of spectacle while retaining a lot of the intricacy of the standard combat. These are some of my favorite sequences in the game, and all of them feel like a fancy dessert after a main course of storytelling since they only show up during pivotal story moments. Of course, an RPG RPG is more than just combat. When it comes to exploration, this game delivers a solid and enjoyable experience overall, but there are some caveats. All areas in this game are closed zones linked together by a larger world map. It isn't open world, but it's also not trying to be, and the zoned-in design feels purposeful. These areas never feel limited in scope or anything, and sometimes I forgot that the game I was playing wasn't open world. There's a variety of locales with different sizes, aesthetics, and atmosphere. Some of them do feel pretty linear, while others feel incredibly expansive. Don't get me wrong, there is a definitive direction you're meant to go to progress the story, but it never feels on rails or like you're just running through a straight corridor for 30 hours. In fact, some areas are so expansive they have their own fast travel points. There's also a central hub area that you revisit throughout your journey, filled with NPCs, shops, and side quests that can lead to you revisiting places that you've seen before. On top of that, there are plenty of other towns and locales that you can visit along the journey that have their own NPCs to interact with too. I do have a criticism of these zones though. Many of the areas in this game don't feel worth exploring during the main quest. The game gives you pretty clear cues as to which direction you're meant to go, usually indicated by a point of interest or little breadcrumbs of item pickups, but I did find myself wanting to explore alternate paths or the road less taken. While you can do this, you usually won't find anything of interest outside of enemies to fight or the odd item lying around. This feels like a huge amount of missed potential, and while you do have some incentive to explore more of some of these areas and side quests, I'm the kind of person who prefers to tackle the side content either toward the end of the game or after I've completely finished the main story. For me, it just doesn't feel like there's much reason to explore outside of either grinding out crafting materials or just taking in the admittedly beautiful scenery. There is still a lot to discover on the main paths though, and this game is absolutely packed full of unique locations to visit. It's really just a mixed bag. The most important criticism that I have though is that some of the RPG stuff that you'd expect to find in a game like this feels shallow at times. The progression with leveling up, unlocking and mastering abilities, and the overall feeling of progress and growing stronger is there, and it's great. That part is executed incredibly well. But there's some stuff that feels almost like it was lost. For starters, there are very few consumable items, limited almost entirely to potions and some temporary stat boosts for a majority of the game. Most of the items that you actually collect are materials for forging and upgrading gear, but a lot of the time these crafting systems feel pointless because you already earn pretty powerful gear through natural story progression. The crafting does become a bit more important later, but for a large portion of the game it's just sitting there in the background underutilized. This goes hand in hand with my complaints about exploration because technically there is incentive to find more of these crafting items in the world, but the reward for doing so can feel underwhelming. This game's gear system feels like a leftover from some earlier, more traditional style draft of the game that just somehow made it all the way into the final product. It's not offensive or bad by any means, but it's a system that doesn't ever feel like it reaches its potential. Fortunately, this game is far more than the sum of its parts, and I can look past all of that. The most important gameplay systems you interact with here are incredibly well executed, and really my complaints can be boiled down to nitpicking. This is another situation where more seasoned Final Fantasy players going into this game with certain expectations might be a bit disappointed. Something I don't think could disappoint anyone though are the visuals. The graphical fidelity and art direction here are absolutely stunning. I constantly found myself blown away by the jaw-dropping set pieces, more so than any previous Final Fantasy game I have ever played. The characters are full of detail and the environments are next level. They all feel meticulously handcrafted to a level of beauty that you could only find in a fantasy setting like this. I found myself spending a lot of time just taking in and staring at these environments, to the point where I spent a pretty significant amount of time in the game's photo mode just trying to get cool looking shots. This game is not short on spectacle, be it the visuals in the world, the fidelity of the characters, and even the insane detail in the cutscenes. I'm sure a lot of this visual beauty is only possible due to the choice to not use an open world, but they sure did make the most of it. Plus, all of this beauty is accompanied by a masterful soundtrack that has a slew of brand new punchy pieces, emotional themes, and neat homages to the series overall. Something I haven't seen a lot of chatter about in this game is the tone. 16 really earns its mature rating right off the bat. There's graphic violence and some incredibly dark themes that you wouldn't normally see in a mainline Final Fantasy title. Fortunately, it's never egregious or just for shock value, and it meshes well with the dark tone that this game sets out to establish. A lot of the violence is implied too, or at the very least just shown off screen, but they did do an excellent job at giving you a mental image of what's going on, or at the very least, just barely showing enough to get the point across. Fans of mainline Final Fantasy games who are getting back into the series with 16 should be prepared to see some gruesome imagery, implied or otherwise. As a lifelong fan of the series, I went into this game excited but also a bit reluctant. I'm always open to changes in my favorite franchises, but Final Fantasy is one of those series where they've definitely set a certain standard of expectations. Sure, the series has changed and evolved over time, but they don't usually make this drastic of a change, at least not in a main title. Typically, you'd expect a wild shift in gameplay to happen in maybe a spin-off or a non-numbered title, so Square Enix putting their entire weight behind a completely different direction seemed like a risky move. It makes you wonder, would this feel like a Final Fantasy game? And honestly, what is a Final Fantasy game anymore? Sure, you've got Moogles and Chocobos in 16, but does that alone make it Final Fantasy? I asked myself this the entire time I played this game and came to the conclusion that Final Fantasy is whatever it wants to be. If Final Fantasy 16 is what the series is now, I wholeheartedly welcome this new direction. The differences in style, tone, gameplay, and writing all feel earned and not different just for the sake of being different. There are some things that are going to be lost along the way, but as a first real attempt at uncharted territory, which is what you could describe as Final Fantasy 16, they really knocked it out of the park. If this is the direction that the series takes going forward, I see a bright future ahead, with solid action combat, a compelling story, and some grand new ideas that really feel cohesive and fun. Final Fantasy 16 makes its mark as one of Square Enix's greatest accomplishments. I can't recommend this game enough, and I can see old and new fans enjoying it. Overall, I highly recommend it. If you have a PlayStation 5, I would say that this is a must-have title for the console. I want to thank my patrons, including specifically GBA SP Gamer, and also people in the Played Every Game tier, including That's Ash and Megan, along with everybody else you see on your screen here. Thank you so much for the support, and thank you for watching this video. As always, have a fantastic day.